Hello everyone, this is Evan Abrams, and in this After Effects tutorial, we're going to look at making properties and layers react to audio. Now, we've covered this topic before on the channel, but reaction to that old video is kind of meh, and that was a long time ago. I think we can do better. So in this tutorial, we're going to look at how After Effects treats audio, we're going to look at how to convert it into data we can use, we're going to look at some expressions that will allow us to make interesting things with that data, and then we're going to spend the second half of the video looking into third-party plugins that are really going to make this process a lot easier and a little bit more nuanced. Hopefully you're reacting positively to this idea and you haven't run away just looking at the length of the tutorial. It is kind of a long one, so please grab a beverage and stick with us. And if you're expecting some kind of React video, we don't really do that on this channel yet. Anyway, let's get into it. I'm Evan Abrams, and this is Reacting to Audio in Adobe After Effects. So inside of After Effects, before we can understand how to make things react to audio, we need to understand how After Effects understands audio. So I've brought an MP3 just down here onto a composition into the timeline, and when you twirl open into these layers, and even video layers and some comps, you will find audio and waveform information. Unfortunately, this waveform isn't something we can point to or reference. If we wanted to use expressions to drive motion based on this waveform, we have to first convert it into something After Effects can use. This process is pretty easy. You just go Animation, Keyframe Assistant, and convert audio to keyframes. When you do, I would advise you to have a look up here, make sure you have your info panel open. This is going to tell you what process is happening, and you don't want to interrupt this. So when we go Animation, Keyframe Assistant, convert audio to keyframes, you'll notice, depending on the length and complexity of what's happening, that process can take a little time. And if you interrupt it, it will fail, it'll be a bummer, you'll have to start over. But if it's done and it succeeded, then you will notice some effects in here. And you'll also notice that if we have a peruse, if we go into the graph editor and look at a value graph, these peaks and valleys look exactly the same as the peaks and valleys on this waveform. So it's showing us how loud this audio is in decibels on each frame. So depending on what you want to do with the audio, that might be fine. But this doesn't isolate out highs, lows, mids, treble, bass. It's not separating out anything. It's literally just loudness. How loud is something on the frame? Now, when we're working with audio, you might need to modify this layer before you convert it. So you could use effects audio, you could use things like bass and treble or high and low pass to remove frequencies or increase frequencies before you do the conversion. So if you're only interested in the bass frequencies, you might put a bass and treble on here. And then you would go in here and you would jack up that bass number and you might reduce that treble, and then you might convert it. And that would give you slightly different data. When we're working with audio in After Effects, when we're going to use it to drive something else, we have three phases. We have the alteration of the audio before we convert, and then the actual conversion when we're turning it into keyframes, and finally, using those keyframes, that data set to drive animation. So we're going to be talking about expressions, and in particular, I want to start by talking about the basic building blocks of these kinds of audio reactions. If you're not familiar with motionscript.com, Dan Ebert's amazing website, one of the first and best examinations of expressions, I highly recommend you check out the design guide, all of these interesting audio and expressions examples. These kind of form the basis for the rest of these things. And we're going to be exploring and explaining some of what is covered in much more detail here on this site. So there's going to be a link to that in the description. When you have time, please go read that, enjoy it. It will hopefully open up the world of expressions to you in a very meaningful way. But in general, let's look at what we can do with just plain old vanilla After Effects. For example, if we want a layer to react to this data set, this data of both channels, you can literally just pick whip to it. You can say, all right, this value now equals this value, but you'll most likely need to use an expression in order to convert it or massage that data to make more sense. So here on the scale of this pink circle, we're driving all of this with this linear expression. Now the linear expression is going to convert or remap values. So if we were just to go one for one, scale is now equal to whatever both channels are, that would make the scale equal to 10.63. That's not super helpful, right? Because 10.63, it doesn't really help us in any way. We need to make use of that data in a meaningful way. Building off of what Dan Eberts has suggested using his exact nomenclature, you first set out your variables, such as the minimum value of the audio, the maximum value of the audio, which means we're setting up these variables to look at this graph, and we're interested in the changes that happen between up here at the top of the graph, which as you can see is around 56, I guess that's as loud as it gets. And then down here near the bottom of the graph, it's like 2.41. That's the loudest and quietest it gets. So we want to set our input range as that range from, say, 2 to maybe 55. If you start altering this range to be narrower, then the output starts to get clipped. So what does that mean? Well, we're examining the audio levels, which is at both channels, from the min to the max, and we're remapping that to our minimum stretch, maximum stretch. So the value 2 will be remapped to 1, the value 55 will be remapped to 5, and everything in between will be the same in a linear way. So if we just look at that output here, you can see the graph looks pretty much the same. If I start adjusting things, like let's say the minimum audio is 10, and now we revisit that graph, you can see this little floor down here, because any value under 10 is just being capped at that floor. All those values are gone. Anything under is also being remapped to 1. So you want to make sure that you're capturing in here all of the data, all of the interesting points that you want. And then what we're doing is just multiplying this remapped, this altered value, and multiplying the current value of this, the current scale value, by that number. The result is something like this. Something that seems to pulse with the loudness, which is okay. We're using the linear here, but you could also use things like the ease out, the ease in. This other layer here is using the ease, and as you can see, they are slightly different from each other because ease remaps slightly differently. You can use this method on any property. You just need to massage the data with a little bit of math. Another way this might look is something like this, where instead of putting this on scale, we've put it on position. And then we've had one that is on beat and the others that are delayed from it. So there's really no end to what you might do with this. It's just how you end up remixing this data. So in this case, we're taking the value and we're adding that remapped information to only one of the axes. So if you want to do that, this is what the expression would look like. A lot of people would ask, well, Evan, I don't want something that reacts 1-to-1. I want something that's triggered sometimes, so that maybe when the kick drum is hit, something happens, or when the hi-hat is hit, something happens. That's a little bit more difficult to do, but we can still trigger things using data. And again, I'll direct you, if you want the full explanation, the full deal on how all these lines of code work, you should definitely be reading this article on MotionScript. It is fantastic to really break down what's going on. But the basic thing is, if you want to trigger animation using data, then you need to have an animation that you can express as an expression. Expressing something as an expression, kind of wacky. So in this case, what we wanted to express was this layer. When a certain loudness is reached, the string here will pluck. All right, so this is what it would look like. Now, in this case, it kind of goes with the music, but all we're doing is looking at that data set, and we're saying, when we pass this threshold of 20 decibels, in this case, you will do this. You will perform this action down here. Now, it's interesting the way this expression works. All of this beefy middle part is basically looking backwards at the data set and saying, well, have we passed the threshold? Okay, if we have, then let's start counting from there. So it's like each time we pass the threshold, we're kind of resetting t value for time. And we can use that to then drive the rest of the animation. But again, the big thing is you have to be able to express what you want the thing to do as a function of t. This is a little bit of an extreme example. We're talking about oscillating. We're talking about the math.sine, all of these things. This is the wobble that Dan Eberts expresses in his article. In a simpler way, though, we can write all kinds of things down there. So in this example, instead of all that complicated wobbling, the only thing that's happening is this bit down here at the bottom. What will happen when the threshold is reached is that the position will go at 960, 540 plus 100 times t times t. And because t will be changing whenever we pass that threshold, it'll be reset to 0 and then start counting again. This will cause this thing to drop rather than wobble. So it's dropping and resetting and dropping. And it's resetting every time we cross this threshold thanks to this series of functions. This is a fairly useful way to trigger things. But again, we're limited because we're only looking at the decibels of this audio. Finally, there's a thing you can do using that same kind of methodology to simply count the number of times we've passed that threshold. So this block of code here does that. So we're counting how many times we've gone past that threshold, which could be valuable if you want to just count the number of beats or have layers come on with every beat, or move the time remapping of a video clip ahead each time we hit a certain beat. Or in this case, we can just make this clock fill in another pi wedge every time it goes. That's also an interesting thing you can do. So these are kind of the three basic building blocks that you can use to make properties in After Effects react to the data set derived from audio. Now, there's a problem with this because ultimately you're only responding to how loud or quiet a certain thing is. That's all the data represents. So if we want to get more in depth at which part of the audio, which frequencies, we're going to probably need to use a third-party plugin. So we're going to look at a couple of those. The first one I'm going to look at is sound keys. So if you apply sound keys onto a layer, you're going to end up with this interesting looking interface. And then when you select the audio layer that you want to look at, it'll start populating this with all of these wonderful bars and lines and all sorts of things. But basically what's happening here is it's displaying the loudness in these certain frequencies. So you can actually isolate where certain things are happening. You'll notice certain instruments or certain parts of a track are going to be hitting in certain frequencies, right? That just makes sense. You'll have high things, low things, and you're able to select up to 3 ranges in here to manually select which parts you're interested in. So whenever the bar graph intersects with this rectangle, that's going to register as data. That's going to start counting up and creating data. But ultimately, what you end up doing with this is clicking apply, and it will output a bunch of keyframes. Again, this is the exact same kind of data set that we're creating when we convert audio to keyframes. We're just converting it in a more nuanced way. And there are a lot of ways to massage this graph, to massage these ranges, to output different data from the ranges, whether it's the peak, the average, or just turning something on or off. There's a lot you can do with these more nuanced data extraction type plugins. So Sound Keys is one of them. And the other one is called Beat Reactor. This is from Boris FX, part of their Continuum line of things, I believe. Beat Reactor, as you can see, similar interface, similar functions. They just organize these concepts differently and have sort of different ways of exporting what you're putting in there. But both of these, I would say, are fairly similar. I will say one thing about Trapcode is if you're using something like Trapcode Form, for example, it already has audio reaction built into some of their particle systems. So you can actually set up audio reactions natively inside those particle systems. You don't need to go through the rigmarole of converting to keyframes and then back again. But as you can see, it's not super nuanced what you can get into. You know, we have the reactors, we have the frequency you're looking at, how wide around that frequency, the threshold, and how strong it is. But it's not a huge amount of massaging to the data. So if you want to get very nuanced, you might still have to fire up sound keys or some other method in order to control this data in the way you really want. But for basic reactions, this does it. This can do that. Now, you're probably saying, well, Evan, that's the same thing. It's not extracting any more information. We're still looking at the loudness of certain frequencies or the loudness of an entire thing. We are selecting more specifically what ranges and what frequencies, but isn't there more information we can pull out of audio? Well, there actually is. There's an interesting plugin called Beat Edit, and we'll just pull up the Beat Edit interface here. When you load up music into it, it tries to analyze that and find where the beats are. So Beat Edit is primarily concerned with where the percussive beats will happen in a song. Now you can play it through and see how well it did. And of course, it seems to have made a bit of an oopsie with this stuff, but you can remove and change and alter what it's going to spit out. But for most of the track, it's pretty spot on. Then you can use it to create markers. You can use it to move keyframes, move layers, duplicate keyframes. In this example, we have this circle that is scaling up with keyframes that I made, and then I just asked it to duplicate it along each of the markers that it created. So I can create a manual thing, a manual reaction, and then have the machine make that reaction happen every time a beat takes place. If you don't want to make your own motion, you can actually use something called the beat wiggle in here that will apply a kind of motion to layers. It's really quite interesting and a very kind of high-end piece of kit. So if you're working with audio a lot, if you need to get the beat of things, I highly recommend at least giving this a try to see. One of the things that's very nice about it is that it does subframe sampling. So as you've probably noticed, if we're only putting information on the keyframes, that doesn't actually capture the nuances of sound because sound is happening in between keyframes. It's separate from keyframe data. But again, this is an interesting third-party tool that is taking care of the third part, the doing something with the data. And finally, I'd like to tell you about a third-party plugin called Freak React that actually takes care of the early phases of audio manipulation, the conversion, and then what you do with the data afterwards. It takes care of all three of those phases, which makes it kind of a unique and interesting proposition. The creator sent it over to me, and I was very thrilled that he did because it has been a joy to kind of work with. So bear with me here while I kind of explain what this does. Off the jump, it starts with doing something very normal, was what we've seen in Sound Keys and Beat Reactor. We have some audio, and then we're going to basically massage that audio. So I'm going to create a little profile here, working in just the work area. And this is an interface that we've seen already. It is that waveform displayed and a rectangle, and we're going to put the rectangle over the audio information, over the peaks and valleys that we're interested in. And the output is over here. It's going to output this data set. That's what it's looking at. Very similar to Sound Keys and Beat Reactor. So for example, if we're only interested in looking at the bass section or the mids or the treble, then we're looking at here 10 to 250 hertz. If our graph is very extreme, then we can just go ahead and make it a little shorter like this, give us a little bit more nuance in what we're looking at. And then what we're going to do is bake this information. We are going to take this stuff and turn it into keyframes. So this is the conversion step where we're taking our waveform data, which in this case is visual data, and we are now going to bake it into keyframes. So far, so good. We've done the first two phases. We've created a data set of the stuff we're interested in. And what it's done is made a whole heap of stuff. It has made so many keyframes in here, all these different custom sets. But because it's turned this stuff into keyframes, it's going to be a lot lighter than if we were using a whole heap of expressions. It's going to render quite a bit faster when we move on to the next step, using these data sets to make something move. And this is kind of where Freak React really takes it to the next level, in my estimation. Let's say we went ahead, let's not look at all these layers. I'll just make an ellipse out here like so. And I want this thing to pulse along with that data set that I've created. So I could go ahead and select this layer. Let's say we'll work with its scale, and I would like it to pulse. So I go here, I select the pulse controller, I hit react. Now this has some sliders to affect the intensity. So let's give it some intensity and we'll see how it goes. So far, so good, right? That this is doing what we'd expect from kind of a basic reaction. But we can now go in and modify the way in which it's working with decays, smoothing. I love the smoothing. without having to go into the expressions and really mix it up in there. For people who are perhaps intimidated by expressions, this is going to be a very useful way of understanding what's happening. Oh, I want this to be smoother. I'll increase the smoothness. Oh, I want this to have a decay on it. Oh, okay, I'll just add a decay to it. So we've got it pulsing. Interesting. We can also apply other forms of movement to this. So maybe let's do something different with the stroke width, let's say. So we've got it scaling. Let's do something with the stroke width. We can select that. We can go into the Freak React. Let's have that oscillate. Let's do that. And now we just go ahead and we apply that. So now there's an oscillation, and we know that it's running off the data set audio 2, and it's being applied to the stroke width, which in this case only has one type of intensity that we can work with. And then here in the mods, let's just see how it do first. That's pretty fun. I think we'll put a little decay on that, a little smoothing. Maybe we will offset it in time a little bit. Maybe give that a try. Now we're feeling fun. So that's how you might make something oscillate, a different form of motion that you can apply to this. You want to get even stranger, you can go into something like the size. And now let's go ahead and add a wiggle to that. Let's make the size wiggling, add some intensities in there, see how we feel about that. There we go. Now it's looking very jelly-like, very strange. And all of that with just a few clicks and not having to write too many expressions. If you want to dive into the wackiness of these expressions, there is certainly a lot of information you can grab and you can learn from. Now, I will say that I would never advocate for not learning expressions. I think expressions are amazing. They open up a whole new world of possibilities. They change your way of thinking. It is an amazing exercise. I would highly recommend that you go through and learn how to make things react to data in this way. But I'll also say that there are a lot of plugins like Freak React, like Sound Keys, like Beat Edit. All of these things do a specific task that can make this fairly complicated and messy process a lot easier, a lot more nuanced, more flexible. And ultimately, deciding if plugins are right for your workflow comes down to how often you do these tasks, if they have a good return on investment. So those are decisions you'll have to make. But I hope that this video has presented you with a lot of options that will help you out making things react to audio in After Effects. If you want to get your hands on any of the tools we talked about in this video, there are links to them in the description, many of which are affiliate links, so I'll get my beak wet if you choose to buy them. A lot of these tools are made by small teams or individuals who are really enthusiastic about making tools that can enable designers to make great things. So share your work around and let people know what you use. If any of this has been helpful to you, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you know when new stuff goes up here. There's new content coming up on the channel all the time, so you don't want to miss out. If you have any trouble with these concepts, let me know in the comments and I'll try to get you through. And if you have more general questions, you can get at me on Twitter at ECAbrams. Thank you so much for watching, and if you do all that stuff, I will see you around the internet.